Greg held his hand up to try and shield himself from the dust and dirt being blown into his face, ever thankful of his mask that protected him. Even so, he couldn't see shit in the storm. The goddamn weather satellites were on the fritz again, so he didn't get any sort of warning before the dust storm had hit him. He sealed up his buggy and proceeded on foot, trying to make it to the nearest shelter so he could wait out the storm in a little bit more comfort than his buggy. He knew the shelter had only been 2 miles away, but it was almost 3 hours later that he found the damn thing. A combination of walking up a hill, through the storm, and then missing the building and having to circle back. Finally, he saw the outline ahead of him and picked up his pace a little. He quickly tapped his code onto the keypad, and as the door slid open, he squeezed through the opening sideways and quickly hit the button on the other side to make it close behind him. This way, he let in as little dirt as possible. As he stood there looking down at the dirt that had blown in around him, he sighed out, but was more than happy to reach up and peel his mask off of his face. The air was recycled, the pump straining to filter out the dirt, but he was fine with that. It beat breathing in grit through his mask. The filters were good, but they were never meant to try and work in a dirt storm. His hair was now mostly dirt, which he began to shake out with a groan. He wasn't scheduled for a shower for another 2 weeks, which wasn't a thrilling prospect, but that was part of the price he knew he'd pay when he signed up for this job. Being part of the first team to terraform a planet was going to be hard work, and he knew it. Once he'd shaken the worst of the dirt out of his hair, he unzipped his duster, hanging it up on a hook next to the door, and looked across the way at the massive sign bolted to the wall of the shelter. It read, 2 possibilities. We are alone, or we are not. Either way, be ready. This was the credo of their team. Be ready. When he had first signed up, he expected some cheesy quote about hope, or building a future, or something along those lines. He hadn't expected be ready, but it was actually a pretty good idea. They were alone out here. The entire team consisted of 200 people on the planet, and another 50 in space. When mankind managed to finally send probes to neighboring systems, they didn't find anything, but they'd expected that. What no one had expected was that as they kept searching, they kept finding nothing. No aliens, no signals, no ruins. They hadn't even found planets with life more complicated than algae on them. This was a problem, since Earth was getting so crowded, so a choice had to be made. Keep searching and hope they got lucky, or start changing. They chose the latter, since FTL drives were expensive, and skip drives were even more expensive, and internal dampeners were the most expensive. They had to be very, very careful with how they started. First, they'd chosen a planet. AM-401 had been chosen, an Earth gravity planet, which was also roughly the same size. The atmosphere was weaker, and the oceans had a fraction of the algae and plankton found on Earth, but nothing bigger living on it. Not to mention the weak-ass moon. An ugly, misshapen, captured asteroid just half the size of the moon back home. They called it the kidney bean. After they picked the planet, they had to pick the team. 250 people had been handpicked from various backgrounds and specialties to fill every job they'd needed. They'd launched off several cargo drones with nothing but automated systems to touch down on the planet, and then a single ship with life support. Of the 250, all but 5 were put into cold sleep. The rest had to keep everyone alive on the 4-year trip to the planet, and it was a one-way trip since they couldn't carry enough fuel to make it back. Once there, they'd woken everyone up and split everyone across the planet. 250 people to monitor all the automated equipment that had been set up on a planet the size of Earth. That was all they could afford to fit on that one life-sustaining ship that was fast enough to get here in 4 years. An additional 100,000 people had been loaded onto a massive sleeper ship and sent out with standard FTL drives, set to arrive in 50 years. Another 5 of those ships were set to arrive 5 years after the first one showed up. This team had to have the planet capable of sustaining life in that time. And while 50 years sounded like a lot, they had a lot of work to do. AM-401 was a nearly dead planet, with barely any plankton, some algae here and there, no grass, no trees, no plants, nothing. They had to strengthen the atmosphere, start growing plants, and seed the oceans with life. In 50 years. On top of all this, they had to fight the environment, boredom, and of course, entropy. They all knew that some of them would die before the colonists arrived. And those that survived would have very little life left to enjoy their work once they were done. But this was a volunteer program. They knew what they'd signed up for. The atmosphere generators were spaced out around the planet with teams of 5, and the 50 in space were split up among small ships to start building orbital stations and satellites. Everyone else had to patrol a sector of ground or ocean and keep everything working. The massive seed crawlers, chem sowers, and river carvers had to be maintained and regularly checked to make sure their programming held. He had Territory 88. Which consisted of the western portion of one of the northern continents. It was roughly the size of the Pacific Northwest back on Earth, and it was his little patch of land, all to himself. He didn't have an atmosphere generator in his section, and the person assigned to patrol the ocean along his coastline was based on an island. So he hadn't seen another human face-to-face since meeting up with Lucy from Sector 87 on New Year's 6 months ago. They were allowed 1 alcoholic beverage apiece, and he'd given her a rock shaped like a fish that he'd found. She'd given him a rock shaped like a bird the year before, so he thought it was fair. In 3 weeks, he'd meet up with Larry from Sector 75 to the south, and they'd grill something if everything went well. He was looking forward to it, especially since that's when he was allowed his next shower. They had to ration clean water until the ocean seeding was done, and they could start irrigation and water treatment. The atmosphere was still too weak to permit rain, so all the water just sat in the ocean. These were just a few of the reasons he figured be ready were the creed of the mission. They needed to make sure they didn't program the machines wrong, that their courses were correct, that they didn't slip up and roll their buggy down a cliff, anything like that. If they hurt themselves bad enough, they were fucked. So he had to be ready to prevent it from happening, or be ready to fix it on his own. He was at least 3 days' drive from the nearest person, and that was in good weather. With this storm raging, he couldn't even call for help. So for now, he sighed and looked around his shelter. The 2 bunks were where they were supposed to be. He walked up to the cupboards and opened them, picking up a list from the wall. Canned corn, beans, meat, beets, soup. Everything was as he'd left it the last time he used this shelter. Setting the list back, he walked to the sink, pulling one of the 2 glasses he had from a shelf and holding it under the faucet before turning it on. He ran it for a few seconds, held up the slightly grainy-looking water with a frown, and pulled his analyzer from his belt. It beeped after a second, informing him the water was the same as before. So he shrugged and took a sip of that grainy tap water. Well, he'd been ready. Then he groaned and sat down on one of the 2 chairs at the small table and listened to the howling wind outside. He wished he'd been able to bring music. The computer on the ship had been corrupted, and to everyone's dismay, they'd lost almost all the programmed music. One of the techs had managed to save the phonograph files for music before 1950, although no one knew why it was in the computer in the first place. So people had broken protocol and got some of the mission's 3D printers to make up some basic record players. And clay records. The clay records didn't last long, but they could always make more. This planet had plenty of mud after all. The director hadn't protested, because you could ask humans to live in near isolation for 50 years, but if you asked them to do it without music, they'd mutiny. For now, his records were in a sealed box in his buggy, and he was left alone in the shelter with the wind. Greg let out a low, heavy sigh and kicked his feet up on the table, listening to the howling all around him. He'd been 25 when he entered the cold sleep. He wasn't sure if the 4 years in cold sleep counted, but he'd been at this job for 5 years now. 45 years to go. He'd be 75 when the first sleeper ship arrived. He'd probably be dead. But he didn't mind if everything went well. When he was alone and bored, he liked to close his eyes, picturing his sector of the planet. Where would people set up their towns and homes? He figured that one bay would be popular. What would they call the town? The mountains further north would be great for skiing. Humans living on a planet orbiting another star. It made him smile. But his quiet was suddenly interrupted. Something tapped the wall of the shelter. He opened his eyes and looked over with a frown. Had the wind gotten strong enough to toss rocks? He heard it again. Clank, clank, clank. From behind the "Be Ready" sign. Greg stood up, unsure what he was hearing. Clank, clank, clank. Clank, clank, clank. Something was tapping on the outside of the shelter, moving along the wall. And then the other as it got closer to the door. He stared at the internal keypad and quickly tapped in a command to lock it. Then he stood back as the tapping got closer. Clank, clank, clank. Finally, the sound tapped on the door. Was it someone else on the mission? Lost in his sector? They'd have told them if they were coming over, right? Clank, clank, clank. The sound was right on the other side of the door. The keypad was out there. If it was human, all they had to do was type on it and he'd see from his side. But no one used the keypad. Clank, clank, clank. The tapping got louder along the door. Greg gulped and looked over his shoulder at the sign. Be ready. Greg quickly pulled his mask back on, grabbed his plasma welder, and he turned it on. Starting at the top of the door, he began to weld it together. Clank, clank, clank. Something was beating on the door now. He continued to fuse the metal of the door together all the way down the line, backing away once it was sealed. He didn't pull his mask off this time. Clank, clank, clank. The sound was stronger than ever as something very firmly knocked on the outside of his door. Something had found him in the dirt storm, on a planet that was supposed to be void of any native life bigger than plankton. Greg was breathing hard through the dirty filters as he stared at the door. But he was the only human in a few thousand miles. He didn't know what was out there, but it wasn't human. Clank, clank, clank. The shelter shook a little as something slammed on the door. Greg stepped over to his duster, pulling it back on as he waited, welder in hand, although he had no idea what he'd do with it. He kept waiting for the sound again. A minute passed. 5. Clank, clank, clank. He groaned out and watched, counting the seconds in his head. Sure enough, every 5 minutes, something beat against his door. Was it testing the metal? It hadn't cracked or bent, but it was a few inches thick. 5 minutes with that howling wind, and then clank, clank, clank. Then, just the wind again. Greg stared at the door he'd welded shut and gulped. Then he sat down in his chair again and stared. The tapping went on for 2 hours. Every 5 minutes, for 2 whole hours. But after those 2 hours, he counted out another 5 minutes and nothing tapped. He sat up a little straighter and kept counting. Half an hour and the howling wind around the shelter finally eased, and then stopped. He looked at the local time. Midnight. It'd be dark, very dark, since the kidney bean moon provided such shitty light. But he didn't feel like going out there right now. He shifted and settled in his chair and finally allowed himself to close his eyes. It felt like he was floating out in space. Blackness around him. He heard a whisper somewhere behind him, but when he turned around, it was still behind him. He heard skittering sounds and something crawled over his feet. He cursed and tried to walk, his legs moving but not touching ground. Something was crawling up his legs as the whispering grew stronger. Don't belong. He growled and kicked his legs harder, even as nothing happened. You belong home on Earth. Go home. Die there. The voice was whispering to him. But for some reason, that was what triggered him. He screamed out, filled with anger and rage as light beamed from his eyes. The darkness was washed away as he saw a floor covered with insects. He yelled and began to stomp on them, kicking them free of his legs. "Fuck you!" was his only answer to the whispers before he suddenly jerked and opened his eyes. He was still in the shelter. Hungry, but awake. There wasn't any more howling. He quickly stood up, bringing up his welder once more. This time, he cut the door back open, unlocking it and tapping on the console. The doors ground open and he stepped out, welder still in hand. Looking around the hill, he just saw dirt. But when he looked down, he saw marks of some sort. Something dragging through the dirt. The outside of the door behind him was covered in single-point marks, as if something had been tapping it with the points of its claws. He shut the door and locked it on the keypad before he began to jog down towards his buggy. The 2 miles that took him 3 hours in the storm was now about 20 minutes as he navigated the broken terrain of the hill. He could see his buggy near the base, since all there was around him was dirt, rocks, and more dirt. When he got down to it, he slowly walked around it, but he didn't see any of those strange tracks near it. The vehicle was completely covered in dirt. He pulled the shovel off the back and scraped the windows clean of dirt. Then he climbed up on top, inspecting the exhaust and intake valves, brushing more dirt off them. After that, he scraped the front intake free of dirt as well, before he was satisfied it was ready to drive. Putting the shovel back into its case, he climbed up into the driver's seat and turned the buggy on. As soon as he had, there were alarms sounding throughout the cabin as his computer came back to life. He cursed as he read the laundry list of warnings. All his long-range comm towers were down, 3 seed crawlers were offline from the storm, and 2 shelters were marked as damaged. There'd been some sort of earthquake to the north, it seemed. Then his eyes focused on the last warning of the list. There was a giant red circle centered on the mountains to the north. Seismic activity had been detected. Local sensors were detecting massive buildups from pressure and heat. He took a deep breath as he read on. Volcanic activity detected. Most of the range was situated on a fissure they'd somehow missed. If the sensors were correct, it was a supervolcano, size of Yellowstone, and it was preparing to erupt. Wasn't there supposed to be a way to stop this sort of thing? He cursed softly as he opened the glove box, pulling out the emergency manual. Flipping through it, he had to scroll a ways until he got to the volcanoes. He looked at the diagram and then back at his computer console. If he drilled into something near the base, he'd be able to vent out the magma? He was going to have to try. Scrolling back over his map, he saw that river carver GX-39 was nearing the base of the mountains, but it wasn't responding. He cursed as he tapped on his console. No signal. Unit unresponsive. He cursed again, and then looked further up. There was another, GX-41. He tapped on it, but he got the same thing. No signal. Unit unresponsive. Oh, fuck this. He cursed and tossed the emergency manual back into the glove box, slamming it shut before he set his buggy into gear. His eyes kept moving over the bleak brown terrain as he drove over the broken ground heading north. It would take him a good 5 hours of shitty, bumpy driving. He'd head past the bay and swing on up to the first river carver, get that activated, then drive around the base of the mountains to get the second one. He just wished that he could make a call to let someone know what was going on. Greg shook and bounced as he drove on, the bad terrain making his buggy bounce around as he drove. But he made himself remember, be ready. He needed to drive fast, but if he got stuck, then it was all for nothing. It took him just over 4 hours before he found the wide track left by the river carver. Without rain, they were just dry beds for now. So he drove down into it and began to cruise up towards the massive machine he could see in the distance. It was as big as some of the sports stadiums back home. A massive tracked vehicle with drills and buckets to dig irrigation paths. But instead of crawling along and dragging up the ground behind it, this one was just sitting there. Near the base, he saw tracks and gulped, bringing his buggy to a halt in that dry riverbed. Climbing out of his buggy, he thought over what might be waiting for him, then gritted his teeth and pulled a fire axe off the back of the buggy. Hefting it in his hands, he looked up at the silent, towering machine before him. He activated the headlights on the side of his mask and began running forward towards the treads. He saw more of those strange, dragging tracks in the dirt. The door at the base of the machine had been left open, it looked like. Not pausing, he ran through those doors, finding the interior of the machine cold and dead. The hallways had scratch marks all along the walls, but he didn't have time to think it over or wait, so he just rushed forward. He was climbing up the stairs, heading to the control center in the middle of the machine when he heard something ahead. He slowed down, walking quietly along the hall as he heard something trashing the control room just around the corner. He closed his eyes for a moment and secured his grip on the fire axe, and then charged. Inside the control room was a creature trying to tear apart all the computer consoles it could. It had legs. Far too many legs, but a fat, slug-like body pressed to the deck. 2 long claws extending from another set of limbs further up towards its head. When it turned to him, he was looking at 4 black eyes arrayed around a circular mouthful of teeth. Greg screamed, and the creature screamed, revealing another fat white eye beyond the rows of teeth. And Greg swung his axe. It tried to scurry back, but Greg was faster. Bringing the axe down on its front limbs as purple gunk flowed free. He began to chop wildly, screaming the entire time as he reduced the creature to flesh chunks, all spewing that purple liquor. Once it was over, he was breathing hard. His axe, arms, and chest stained in that purple shit. Then he looked over the controls, rushing to the back of the control room to open the storage locker. Pulling out replacement parts, he quickly repaired the consoles he would need, turning his welder down to solder the pieces back into place and finish up. Once that was done, he frantically activated the machine, waiting for it to power on before he cycled the systems, checking them off as they came online. Human. He looked around, and then down at the console's radio. You must not do this. Your species was meant to live and die in your home system. It's pure arrogance to think you should leave. The planets that did not grow their own life are meant to be dead. We will purge this attempt to make it live. We have waited centuries in case you should try. You will not succeed. Greg didn't even pay attention. He was already getting the machine running and setting what he figured would be its last task into the automated computer before it started to rumble forward towards the mountains ahead. Human, you will fail. This planet will remain dead. The voice was yelling as he left the control room, turning around to weld the door into the command center shut. Rushing back down and out of the crawler, he slowed, hefting the axe into his hand as he scanned the area. Be ready. But nothing stirred, aside from the machine above him. Quickly, he jogged back to his buggy, tossing the axe into the passenger seat and climbing in. As the machine began to rumble forward, he was already picking up speed, driving east to swing around the bottom of the mountain range and up to the second river carver. His radio picked up a signal and he turned it on. Human, you need to He turned it off. He drove for another 2 hours, and around the edge of the mountains. He could see the smoke rising from some of the peaks as he checked his computer. The first river carver had started to drill, but he didn't know if one hole would release enough pressure. He kept driving up and over the hills and ridges, skidding around rocks and bouncing along as his stomach growled heavily at him. He could eat if he survived this. However, as he crested a hill, he saw another of those slug spiders, and it saw him just as his buggy slammed into that fat body. Purple smeared up and over his windshield as he cursed, swerving as he felt his buggy turn and roll. Quickly, he grabbed the axe with one hand, trying to hold it down as the vehicle rolled over and over. When it came to a stop, he was upside down, groaning as he unfastened his restraints and then kicked the door open. He crawled out with his axe in hand, but saw no more of those creatures. The machine was in the distance, and the smoke pouring from the mountains was growing thicker. Reaching back into his flipped buggy, he pulled out his supply crate, strapping the box to his back and making sure he still had his welder before gripping the axe in his hands and running forward. He saw more of those tracks near the base of the machine and ran inside the open doors, but one of those creatures was waiting. It lunged at him from the darkness, knocking him onto his back, the supply crate propping him up. It hissed and snapped at his face, but he held his axe up, keeping it from getting to him. He couldn't force it off, though, so he had to press up with his axe with one hand and quickly shove his welder into the thing's face. It didn't have time to pull back before he turned it on, and it screamed for a second as its face blistered and burned. It twitched and jerked, and Greg cried out as one of those claws sank into his shoulder before it fully died. But then, he could shove the slug body off of him and get up. He groaned as he felt the pain in his shoulder, the blood seeping down his duster. But he ignored it and rushed forward once more. There wasn't any noise coming from the control room this time, but as he charged into it, he saw that the damage had already been done. Before he could look behind him, something slammed into his supply crate. He staggered forward and was pulled around a little by the straps on the crate. He heard the creature behind him gurgle in anger. It had sunk those claws into the crate thinking it was part of Greg. Quickly, Greg pulled free of the straps and turned it as he swung his axe, cleaving the thing's head off in a single swipe. As it slumped, that purple ichor spewed out, but he was already shoving it into the hall and closing the door to the control room. The parts were scattered all around the room, and it had found the spares in the back. He looked it over and cursed. He could fix the main components, but there was no way he'd get the automated systems back up. He just shook his head and pulled parts from his supply crate, starting to fix the control room back up. He heard something moving in the hall and quickly locked the door, welding it shut from the inside before turning back to his work. There was hissing as the creature slammed into the door, but it held. Once he got the systems back up and running, he turned it on and the machine hummed to life. Quickly, he started moving it forward, drilling into the base of the mountain. He didn't know how long he's had, but he was moving as fast as possible to punch another hole in the volcano before it went critical. The radio sparked to life. "Human, you cannot do this. You have to leave the planet dead. Only gods can create life. You are committing sacrilege." Quickly, he turned the radio off and drilled into the mountain. Soon there was nothing but the floodlights on the machine itself looking ahead into the drill's path as he cut through the stone. Looking at the computer console to aim the thing where it needed to go. In half an hour, he'd drilled a hole the size of a stadium into the mountain. Ahead, he could see the steam coming off the rocks. The barrier between his hole and the molten rock beyond was very thin. Thinking it over, he started to back the machine out, knowing the pressure would break the barrier, and the lava would come pouring out soon enough. He backed the machine out, but as he started to turn away from the hole and up the mountain out of the path of the lava, something loud snapped and broke somewhere in the machine. It ground to a stop, and he saw the flashing light regarding engine failure. The creatures? It didn't matter. Soon the hillside would be covered in molten rock. His buggy was flipped, this machine wouldn't budge, and running on foot would be suicide. He let out a heavy sigh then, slumping in the command chair. He might survive here. The control room was well protected. What were his chances? 50-50? 1 in 10? He shrugged and stood up, walking over to his supply crate as he opened it again. The creature had pierced his records, it seemed. Wait. He had one left. He smiled and stood, walking to the back of the control room as he found a machine the creature hadn't noticed. He set the record in place, flipping the switch as the surface began to turn and the needle picked up the tiny bumps. It was scratchy, but he could hear the music just fine. I see trees of green, red roses too. The lava began to bubble out of the hole he dug, and he sat down in his control chair, propping his feet up on the console. As he closed his eyes, he listened to the music and wondered, what would they name the bay? Would it be a resort town? An industrial center? Maybe they'd set up a university out here, study the volcanoes. It was a shame he couldn't warn the others. But he knew they'd be all right. They were ready. Humanity always was. Stacy had been playing around in the park with her mom and dad and her stupid little brother. It had been a good day. Nice and warm. Not too warm, though, since a nice breeze kept the white puffy clouds swimming through the sky. As she pushed through some bushes while wandering through, she saw a big statue. It was a guy leaning back against a stone. He was smiling as he looked out over the bay. She wondered who he was. There was a big plaque at the base of it. She read the name Greg before she heard her mom. Stacy, food's ready. Where'd you go? Coming, Mom, the girl called out, turning and running out of that little hidden spot to meet up with her family. They'd made her favorite lunch. She'd find out who the statue guy was later.